this is the question that I'm asking today. Is there an anti-inflammatory diet for pets? It's well accepted and good morning, everybody. It's well accepted in humans that there is an anti-inflammatory diet. It's discussed among nutritionists and doctors, but it's not something that's discussed in pet medicine, dog and cat medicine, unless it's the integrative vets, the holistic vets, who do a lot of, let's face it, pre-discovery for the rest of medicine. Now we're going to, okay, that worked the first time. We'll just do that. No, we won't. Nothing is moving it.
No, I had the same problem.
I did that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Robin? I did that. Wait, I did that, but you did that. Okay.
Yeah, I did that, but actually this is... Okay.
Now it's working? Okay.
Yeah,
now it's working. Okay.
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 Me, Robin, up on the
Yeah. So to address this question, I'm going to go through sort of three main areas today. And the first is we have to establish that chronic inflammation is present in pets, like it is in humans. And then we're going to look at nutrition from three different sort of viewpoints. Number one, does the macronutrient profile have any relationship to inflammation? And macronutrient, if you're not familiar, means the energy-containing nutrients, carbohydrates, specifically starches and sugars, fats and protein. Or is it ingredients in the pet food, or could it be the fact that most pet food is processed? So what are the roles of all three of those aspects of nutrition? And then we might just talk about what an anti-inflammatory diet in pets might look like. So first, let's just start with establishing that there is chronic inflammation in pets. If you consider inflammatory diseases, chronic inflammatory diseases, we know that allergies, for instance, atopic dermatitis, environmental allergies, and osteoarthritis are quite common. I actually was surprised at this statistic. Over 20% of dogs over a year have some degree of osteoarthritis. And we're talking about systemic inflammation here. Atopic dermatitis, up to 27% of dogs, I can tell you, in the southeast U.S., which is semi-tropical, it's a lot more than that. Enteropathy, you don't see chronic enteropathy quite as often in dogs, but I've not seen this study done, but I would bet 50% of older cats have chronic enteropathy. Well-recognized problem. If your cat is vomiting hairballs, your cat has chronic enteropathy. It's not a hairball problem. It's a gut problem. And then, of course, obesity. Over 50% of the dogs and cats in developed countries, except for this one apparently, but they are either overweight or obese. And that's a well-recognized inflammatory disorder. And finally, aging. Aging is an inflammatory disorder. In fact, there is a specific condition called inflammaging, which we believe occurs in all animals. Humans, well-recognized. It's also recognized in dogs and probably cats as well. And what happens is that you kind of live your life, and is the pointer's not great. Anyway, you live your life and you start out responding to the environment, responding to viral infections and bacterial infections. And as you live your life, you're exposed to more antigens, for instance, from the environment, pollens, for instance. And the immune system sort of becomes accustomed to reacting, and over time, it loses control and kind of becomes chronically activated. And so the milieu, the immune sort of situation for all people, all animals, is once you start passing middle age, you are in a chronic inflammatory state because the immune system is now producing more pro-inflammatory cytokines and doesn't know how to turn itself off. At the same time, the specific immune system, the adaptive immune system, is not getting as much energy. And so you're unable to react to specific stressors like viruses, like vaccines. And so, for instance, in older people, the vaccine response is not as robust. So this is inflammaging. It occurs in humans. It occurs in dogs and cats. And it means that any dog, cat, human that is aged is in a state of chronic systemic inflammation. So in humans, we know the diseases that are associated with chronic inflammation, systemic inflammation, including Alzheimer's, diabetes, obesity, COPD, chronic enteropathy, immune-mediated diseases, cancer, viral infection. Those all occur in dogs and cats. They're a little bit different, some of the cardiovascular diseases in humans, but certainly we have cardiovascular disease. So these are well known to be associated with chronic systemic inflammation. And in human nutrition, a dietary approach is well accepted. We know that the approach for many chronic problems really is better nutrition and exercise, but specifically, many of these require a reduction in caloric intake, understandably, if it's, say, metabolic syndrome that was started out with obesity. But also in human nutrition, it's well recognized that you want to play with the macronutrients. For people, it's recommended that you reduce fat intake, right or wrong. That's the recommendation. But another recommendation is to reduce starches and sugars, easily digestible carbohydrates. And so that's the low glycemic diet, which I'll talk a bit more about. And then another is to increase fiber. Also, though, you hear a lot about changing the ingredients, introducing more fruits, vegetables, nuts into your diet, eating more fish. So this is, kind of where we're talking about these aspects, changing the macronutrient proportion to address inflammation, changing the ingredients, and as I mentioned, processing is another issue. So let's look at the macronutrient question first. And let's start where we are, frankly. This is a nice review paper, which I guess now you can't see. I've got all these references, though. This is a nice review paper on humans looking at the diet and inflammation, chronic systemic inflammation. And what this author says is that dietary patterns that are high in refined starches and sugar, saturated and trans fatty acids, and poor in natural antioxidants and fiber from fruits and vegetables, and poor in omega-3 fatty acids are associated with chronic excessive pro-inflammatory cytokine production and inflammation. And if you look at a very typical, this is a premium diet made by one of the big three international food makers, so we're talking Hill's, Nestle, Purina, Royal Canin, you all know them. The first two ingredients, and in fact this is probably the majority of the formula, is refined starches. I know this because there's only one animal protein product, and guess what? They had to add amino acids because there's not quite enough animal protein in there. So this is a mostly refined starch diet. It's also got some refined plant proteins in it. Do we have antioxidants? Yes, these are synthetics. You can't see this, I know, but you've got synthetic vitamin E and A. Do we have any of the natural, like the natural antioxidants like polyphenols? There is some from the plain beet pulp, which is, it's basically the fiber source in this diet. And there is some in green tea extract and marigold extract, but look at where these fall. I mean, the beet pulp comes after natural flavoring. You know that's not in there very much. In fact, AFCO requires that be something like less than 4%, 0.4%, I believe. And then these are coming right behind all the trace nutrients. So there's just not very much in there of natural sources of these plant antioxidants. All right, who's familiar with the glycemic load or glycemic index of a diet? Low glycemic diet, a couple people. So what this says is that if you have ingredients, if your diet is composed of ingredients that are mostly sugar and starch and induce a rapid rise in blood glucose when you eat them, that's a high glycemic index diet because it has high glycemic index ingredients. That's a pretty well-established concept in human nutrition. It's not so in dogs and cats. However, I'll show you that one group has started working on that, and it correlates pretty well. So I'm going to talk about the glycemic index. If you just sort of look at general rules in dog and cat food, this came, I believe, from pet food industry. Frozen, and by frozen, I believe they mean raw. This is the distribution percent of calories that come from protein, fat, or carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, sugars, and starches, not fiber. So you can see that these frozen raw foods generally are very low in highly digestible carbohydrates. Canned diets, really, they vary all over the place. You can make a canned diet with exactly the same macronutrient profile as a raw diet. But a dry diet, you cannot do that. They're very high in highly digestible carbohydrates because it's required to make a kibble, to form a kibble. So they're always going to be different, and they're going to be a higher glycemic index diet. That's what a kibble is going to be. Just looking at the glycemic index, the actual number for ingredients that are used in pet foods, you can see over here on the left column, these are the ingredients, and these two are meats, and they have a glycemic index of 0 because they don't induce a glycemic response when you eat them. You don't immediately shoot your blood sugar up when you eat them. On the other hand, these carbohydrate ingredients do, because that's what they're supposed to do. They contain carbohydrates. And so, for instance, for corn grits, which is pretty common in pet foods, that number is 22. I can't see it. No, 69. And you can see these vary anywhere from the high 20s to the high 70s. Well, this is a group from Saskatchewan who started working on this sort of glycemic response in dogs. And you can see that the numbers are not too different. So for corn grits, 57 to 37 really. And for peas, not at all dissimilar to the human glycemic index number. And for rice, which brewer's rice or white rice is used a lot in pet foods, pretty similar to the human numbers. So these are high glycemic index ingredients that are used in pet foods commonly. So, is there evidence in humans that a high glycemic index diet can lead to inflammation? And in fact, there's this great review article, and they found 22 high-quality studies that they could look at. And in this review, they found of 9 observational studies, and so if you're not familiar, observational studies are going to be somewhat lower in quality. 5 observational studies out of 9 where where an inflammatory response was associated with a high glycemic index diet. It wasn't quite as good for interventional studies. These are like controlled clinical trials. 3 of 13 of these interventional studies showed a positive correlation between a high glycemic index diet and inflammation. So these are sort of varied results and conclusions, but there is some evidence that a high carbohydrate, high glycemic index diet is associated with inflammation in humans. The problem is that all of these have pretty different diets. Some of them are eating standardized diets and some aren't. So you're probably not going to get an across-the-board, very consistent answer. This study has been done in dogs, at least one study I found. And in this one, what they did was they put together 2 kibbles, and one was a high-starch kibble and one was a high-fat kibble. And then they did metabolomics looking at a variety of gene products, and what they concluded when they looked at inflammatory markers was that there was no difference in the diets. I don't know, this is the high-starch diet on the left with all the red up there. This is the high-fat diet on the right with all the blue up there. They look very different to me, and in fact, there were 5 what they call non-annotated compounds, molecules, so we don't know what those 5 were. I'd say clearly a high-starch versus a high-fat diet leads to different metabolic responses. We just don't know what they are. They think they're not inflammatory responses, or that there was no difference between the 2 diets. I will tell you that there were 2 kibbles. They were testing one kibble against the other kibble. So I don't think that's an ideal situation when you're talking about testing high versus low carbohydrates, since kibble can't really be very low in carbohydrates. You can look at other things instead. So these are studies that look at the hormones of satiety and sort of fat accumulation. So leptin is actually known to have a pro-inflammatory effect, where adiponectin is known to have an anti-inflammatory effect. And we've got these 3 interesting studies at least. First one showed that in dogs, when they were fed low glycemic index starches, they had lower leptin concentrations. So that means it's a less of an inflammatory response when they eat low glycemic index ingredients in the diets. From the Netherlands, they did a trial somewhat similar to that and found similarly that they did with the low glycemic index ingredients, there was less of a decrease in adiponectin. So adiponectin I have to think of as the good guy. And in the low glycemic index diets, there was a reduced leptin release. So that's the bad guy. And there is one in cats, and they kind of looked at the same thing and found that when they fed a high glycemic index diet or a high carbohydrate diet, that suppressed the most active form of adiponectin. So we do have some indirect evidence here that a high glycemic index or a highly digestible carbohydrate diet leads to inflammatory responses. Pretty interesting. But again, those are all comparing kibble to kibble. So this is one of these first that was published straight out of DogRisk. from Johanna's study and Robbins, where they looked at metabolomics in dogs fed either a sensitive skin kibble or a raw diet. So here we're comparing a raw diet that's going to be very low glycemic index, very low in carbohydrates, mostly meat, to a kibble that's kind of on the high end of all of the kibbles, starch content-wise. And what they found was that in the raw diet, genes that suppressed inflammation were activated. That's what they found was increased levels of, increased expression of genes that suppress inflammation and genes that suppress oxidative stress. So this is a bit more direct, comparing a raw diet, very low glycemic index, to a kibble, very high glycemic index, or at least high glycemic index. There is evidence that the carbohydrate component may be responsible for increased inflammation. We have two other studies, and I think this is making a really strong case for this idea that raw food is anti-inflammatory. I just went to the punchline, sorry about that, but I'm going to make you go through all these studies to get there anyway. The first study is observational. It was from another group here in Helsinki, and what they did was look at, I think it's over 4,000 privately owned dogs. It was a lot. They did metabolomics on them and found that in dogs eating raw, they had reduced levels of this one marker for inflammation called glycoprotein acetyls. And so in the raw-fed dogs, looked like they had lower levels of this inflammatory marker. The best study was out of New Zealand a few years ago, and this was a controlled clinical trial. They looked at beagles eating either a kibble or a meat diet, a raw meat diet, looked at pro-inflammatory genes, so cytokines that are pro-inflammatory, and again, found that the dogs fed raw diets had lower, a raw diet suppressed the expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and a kibble diet increased expression of those pro-inflammatory cytokines. And so, to put it simply, it looks again like kibble leads to inflammation. I'll just put it simply. And in fact, those authors, this is a quote from the paper, these results are consistent with the kibble diet having a pro-inflammatory effect and the meat diet having an anti-inflammatory effect. If you saw that quote anywhere but a peer-reviewed paper, you'd go, crazy holistic doctor, because that's what people do say. I hear it all the time. This is in a peer-reviewed paper, and we have 3 studies showing that raw diets have an anti-inflammatory effect when compared to a kibble diet. So I think that we do have some evidence that a high digestible carbohydrate content in a diet leads to inflammation, but those studies are they have kind of inconsistent results, and it may be because they're testing different kinds of diets. And of course, when you compare raw to kibble, a nutritionist is going to critique a study like that, saying, well, fine, it's got a completely different macronutrient profile, yes, but it also compares different ingredients. So we can't really isolate out and say, oh, the digestible carbohydrates are the problem. So why don't we look then at the second aspect of nutrition that may influence inflammation, and that is processing. Does processing have an effect on inflammation in animals? First, let's just talk about why. Who in the room has heard of AGEs, or advanced glycation end products? A few? Okay. So I'll go through those, but let's just talk about, in a general way, why processed foods are potentially pro-inflammatory. And the first is heat destroys antioxidants. And so it can destroy the natural food-based, the plant-based polyphenols that have an antioxidant effect and anti-inflammatory effect. It can also destroy the synthetic antioxidants that a food maker is going to add to the diet to help prevent oxidation and spoilage. Also, simply mechanical processing can reduce antioxidant levels. So if you think about it, just mincing a meat, if you've got a chicken breast, there's so much surface area exposed to oxygen, so that's oxidation. If you mince it up, that's a lot more surface area, right? But if you mince it up, you cook it, you dry it, and you turn it into a powder, that's a lot more surface area. So mechanical processing and heat both destroy antioxidants. Also, cooking creates these AGEs, or advanced glycation end products. And so if you don't know them, I'm going to introduce you now because they're important. AGEs are a Maillard reaction product. That means they are the result of the Maillard reaction in cooking. And the Maillard reaction requires a protein, or more specifically the protein building block, an amino acid. and a sugar, a reducing sugar. One of them is glucose. And under heat, those combine and they produce browning. And so the Maillard reaction products are considered desirable in crusty bread and coffee and grilled meats, French fries. So Maillard reaction products are why a lot of these foods taste good, that browning reaction. And in fact, kibble makers consider those desirable for palatability for dogs and cats. The problem is that they are absorbed and they do cause changes in the proteins in the body. So how do they do that? One of the things that they do is they are incorporated into proteins that are processed, made in the body. And when they're incorporated into these proteins, they change the protein function. So if it's a structural protein, let's just say that the Achilles tendon in a human who's 60 years old, that human's been eating a lot of AGEs throughout their lifetime. You get accumulation of a lot of these AGEs in the collagen in the Achilles tendon. You get a weak Achilles tendon, and suddenly your Achilles tendon ruptures when you're working out for no reason. So you get changes in structural proteins. You also get changes in metabolic enzymes, for instance. And so if you have enough of these AGEs incorporated into active enzymes, you may not process food normally. Maybe that you process food in a way that accumulates more fat, makes you more sensitive to fewer calories, for instance. And so structural changes to proteins, that's a really important bit of damage that they do. They also have their own receptor called RAGE, so it's the receptor for AGEs. And when RAGE is bound, it's known to do some pretty awful things. It does increase oxidative stress locally in the area, but also it recruits inflammatory cells. So these AGEs, when they bind their receptor, directly promote inflammation. Right. Finally, we believe, there's not as much work on this, I don't think, but we believe that AGEs can be toxic to the microbiome. So when you eat these diets that are full of crusty brown goodness, it is causing inflammation. Well, pet foods are full of them. Study after study, in fact, has shown that they're full of them. It depends on the formulation, right? So if you have a canned food that doesn't have very much carbohydrate in it, then it's not going to make as high levels of AGEs. But if you have a dry food that's got lots of carbohydrates in it and proteins, then it's going to make lots of AGEs. And so you find levels vary throughout a range of dry products or throughout a range of canned products. A canned product with high levels of carbohydrates will have AGEs in it. And we've done that work in-house, and we can see exactly that. Raw food isn't cooked, so raw food, not going to have very much. It does contain AGEs because the animal itself makes AGEs in the body. We make our own AGEs, but it's not going to be as high as processed foods. I told you that I didn't tell you. In humans, these things are associated, clearly associated with some of the most important chronic inflammatory diseases that humans die from, including diabetes, renal disease, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, lung disease, COPD. So a lot of these very common diabetes, we see these in dogs. And in fact, there are a few very preliminary studies in dogs, lots and lots of studies in people, not very many in dogs. And I just have kind of a list here. I'm not going to go through them individually, but what I'll tell you is that these are mostly observational, like case reports. There are, I think, 2 experimental studies in there. And what they show is that AGEs accumulate in pathologic tissues. So this is not what you could call direct evidence yet, but I'd say it's really supportive based on what we have so far in dogs and cats. And so AGEs contained in processed foods and also the destruction of antioxidants could make processed foods more pro-inflammatory than raw foods. Oops, now we want to talk about ingredients. And let me do this, just one second. Any questions so far? Yeah. Not necessary, I can hear you and I'll repeat it.
Hello. Right, so a few years ago, I also investigated on raw food versus kibble as a dog owner because I wanted to give the best food for my dog. And I found that a lot of people dislike raw food because of the heat antioxidants. So they think that if you give raw meat then there are a lot of dangerous bacteria. And I've heard that a lot of people are against raw food because of that possibility that the bacteria can be bad for the dogs. So
Sure,
what do you think?
sure. And that's a very general sort of well understood. All of us in research or in sales, we understand that there's a lot of pushback. That's why we're doing what we're doing.
Okay.
So we are trying to disprove a lot of these claims made by people who don't believe in raw.
So the oxidants are more important, are like better for the dog's health than the risk of anything happening because of raw.
It's a bit more. It's antioxidants, and it's a lot more complicated than that, actually. But
Yeah, I could just comment here 1 minute. We can talk about this in the panel discussion, but we have done a lot of studies as well, and actually just showing that there are pathogens. There's actually more pathogens in human food than in dog food, raw dog food in Finland. And that is just because nobody thinks that you would eat raw meat for humans. So they're not as they don't have to do such a good job as the dog food industry in Finland has to do. So that was quite amazing. And then we did a study that was also replicated that was done in 81 countries with 69,000 years of DogRisk to pathogens going from raw dog food to human foods. And we got 3 cases and 63 maybes, but most of the 63 maybes had children that were in daycare, and so they thought that maybe that was actually the bigger risk. But it's a thing that, of course, always we have to think about. So thanks for the question.
And to just close that out, because it's a bit off topic, I will say the level of contamination of foodborne pathogens probably varies area to area, country to country, and I would say we have pretty bad foodborne pathogens in the U.S., and so it's quite necessary for us to use pathogen mitigation procedures. Cooking is one of them. We use high-pressure pasteurization, and you're going to hear more about that from Susie Teggiati later. So, all right, so we've talked about macronutrient profile as a possible source of inflammation, and specifically high digestible carbohydrates like sugars and starches causing inflammation. And we talked about how processing it kind of looks like a candidate for causing inflammation from those AGEs and the loss of antioxidants. But let's talk about specific ingredients now. The ingredients are the basis of these diet inflammatory index scoring systems. There are 3+ in humans, and essentially they're based on what kind of an inflammatory response a specific ingredient causes in a human, and they measure things like TNF, tumor necrosis factor, CRP, which is C-reactive protein, other things. And based on what that ingredient causes in the human, it's put somewhere on the score sheet. So these score sheets exist in humans. I'm not sure how much nutritionists in the human nutrition field actually use them. This is just one review paper that kind of shows you how these fall out. And up here, and this is going to be really hard for you to see, I recognize, but up here, if you can see the pointer, these are on the top ribbon, these are conditions like overweight, obesity, this is type 2 diabetes, this is metabolic syndrome. And then here are specific, mostly fruits and vegetables. And if it's green, that means that, for instance, cranberry has an anti-inflammatory effect in people with metabolic syndrome. And there's some that are pro-inflammatory, like grape actually causes inflammation in people with metabolic syndrome for some reason. Maybe they're talking about in the form of wine, I don't know. But you can see that there are a lot of greens here. There's some where there's no effect, and that's a lot of studies. That represents quite a few studies. The thing is, the point I want to make here is that the doses of these foods that are anti-inflammatory, they're not top dressing. They're not a bit of powder on top of a bowl of kibble. These are significant parts of the diet. So for instance, for juices, the dose was anywhere from 100 to 600 mils per day. That's like 2.5 cups per day. For the actual fruits and vegetables, mostly fruits in this study, it was up to 230 grams of fresh fruit per day. So this is a significant ingredient in the diet, and not like throwing a couple of blueberries a day to your dog. And in fact, this is one of these websites, University of Chicago Medicine pays a lot of attention to this subject, and they say if you have an inflammatory lifestyle, eating a primarily inflammatory diet, for instance, just eating one anti-inflammatory food is not going to help you enough. So you need to consider making fruits and vegetables a significant part of the diet, and I will say that some raw diets do that. This is the whole problem when we talk about comparing raw to kibble and saying it's the macronutrient profile. It's simply because kibble doesn't have, kibble has too much starch in it. No, raw can actually contain fruits and vegetables where kibble can't. I know that what you're going to say, that some kibble does, so we're going to talk about that. But let me just prove to you that not just in humans, but in dogs, these fruits and vegetables have anti-inflammatory effects. There's this great review paper that came out about 3 years ago now, and he went through all the studies where they looked at plant extracts or fruit and vegetable extracts, or the fruits and vegetables themselves had effects on dogs. And I was easily able to pull out 5 or 6 studies showing, for instance, that in older dogs, blueberries do decrease pro-inflammatory gene expression. In dogs with, and this was experimental, but in dogs with metabolic syndrome, green tea extract, the polyphenol extract, suppressed inflammation along with other things, made them more sensitive to insulin, which is a good thing. Curcumin is, it may be familiar to many of you, it's the sort of primary active ingredient from turmeric, and it's contained in my favorite osteoarthritis supplement for my German Shepherd. She really doesn't do well without it. It needs to have the curcumin in it. Has been shown to have an anti-inflammatory effect in dogs. And the soybean unsaponifiables, that was in the old Cosequin. If you know Cosequin, that's proven to have an anti-inflammatory effect. And in an ex vivo study, pumpkin polyphenolics, so an extract of pumpkin downregulated pro-inflammatory genes in the cornea of the eye. So just pulling out from that one review study, we've got all kinds of evidence that fruits and vegetables have an anti-inflammatory effect. And this is just to show you the number of studies in that paper about the benefits of fruits and vegetables. This is a table, so it's a good one if you get a chance to take a look at it. So why would fruits and vegetables have any benefit? Why would they influence inflammation? And when you look at all of the sort of preclinical studies, the in vitro studies, they do lots of things that we know about. As far as inflammation is concerned, they do modulate arachidonic acid metabolism, which is responsible for the production of cyclooxygenase, lipoxygenase, PLA2, and if your dog, for instance, is on one of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, I don't know what you use here, but like Previcox, Rimadyl, Metacam, that's a COX-2 inhibitor. Sure would be great if you could use fruits and vegetables instead. NF-kappa B is a pro-inflammatory gene, so we know that a lot of these have a pretty powerful effect on NF-kappa B, and there are other effects there that may impact inflammation. And if you think that looks like a list of drug activities, yeah, it does. Fruits and vegetables have some pretty powerful activity. Just a note about this. So yeah, fruits and vegetables contain these polyphenols and other extracts. However, many, if not most, are heat sensitive. Something to keep in mind. So this was an interesting study, and what they did was feed 4 different plant extracts. So blueberry anthocyanins, curcumin from turmeric, an extract of echinacea, and an extract of milk thistle, and looking for anti-inflammatory activity in dogs, in 24 dogs. And again, I know that you can't see this now, but if I'm just going to point this out, this is turmeric right there, CL. And if you go across this line, looking at TNF activity is reduced by about 100%. NF-kappa B activity is reduced over 250%. So very powerful activity. Again, this is from dogs in vitro, but very powerful activity. This was looking at keratoconjunctivitis sicca in dogs, KCS, if anybody has dogs with this, dry eye. And they took clinical patients who had what we call failed therapy. I don't know why you put it on the dog. The dog failed. The therapy failed the dog. And so they added plant extracts to a kibble. And I put these results up here only to show you kind of how impressive they are. So this is looking at tear production, Schirmer tear testing for the vets. And you can see that tear production in these dogs is significantly higher after being treated with the plant extracts. You can't see this, but conjunctival inflammation is significantly lower. And it goes on and on. The corneal, when it becomes opaque because it's being so chronically irritated, that's significantly reduced. Pigmentation, significantly reduced. Mucus discharge, significantly reduced. These are from polyphenols from plants. So again, pretty powerful effects, anti-inflammatory effects. And then we've got this one in cats. And again, what they did was add these 3 plant extracts. So fenugreek, which is a spice, tulsi, a spice, and then green tea extract. They added them to diets, and I'll just show you. They fed these for 84 days. So what you have here is the TNF-alpha, which is pro-inflammatory cytokine. You have the TNF-alpha level before starting and then after 84 days. It's down a little bit from eating all of the control diet. From eating the control diet, but not significantly. If you feed the control diet and these plant extracts, there's no difference at the end of 84 days. And that looks kind of disappointing. But what they did then was they added arachidonic acid, which is pro-inflammatory. So they fed these cats the control diet and arachidonic acid, and it increased inflammation. Not significantly, but it clearly did. Then when you take that group, you add arachidonic acid to the diet, and then add those botanicals, significantly lower levels of TNF. So we have all kinds of studies showing that plants have anti-inflammatory effects in dogs and cats. So they probably need to be in an anti-inflammatory diet. I also just want to mention bioactive peptides and other bioactives in meat. Raw meat does contain some things that probably have anti-inflammatory type effects as well. For instance, glutathione is kind of a central antioxidant in everybody's metabolism. And glutathione, in many cases, is heat sensitive. Creatine, believe creatine has a slight antioxidant activity. It does have other activities, but it's very heat sensitive. It turns into a kind of a bad compound when it's cooked. Animal-derived indigestible dietary components is essentially poorly digestible protein, like collagen, for instance, raw meat that contains some tendons. That has a fiber-like effect in the gut of carnivores. So if you cook it, it breaks it into smaller protein pieces and may not have the same effect. And finally, these are these bioactive peptides. It's a really new area of research. What they do is they take meat and they hydrolyze it by an enzyme. It's the same way it's hydrolyzed in our stomachs by hydrochloric acid. So it's hydrolyzed, and then they pull out these specific bioactive peptides and test them for activity. And I'll tell you one example from whitefish that's hydrolyzed. They found 22 different compounds that had ACE inhibition activity. ACE inhibition, I can't remember the name of the drug offhand, drug type. If you remember, tell me. Anyway, very powerful, almost pharmacologic-like effects. And these have anti-obesity functions, anti-diabetic, antioxidant, anticoagulated. There are all kinds of things that they do. Some of them have opioid effects. They're very powerful. And again, depending on the size of the peptide, those can be destroyed during heating as well. So there's one other thing about polyphenols that I think might add to their effect, and that is they can reduce the metabolism and absorption of carbohydrates, highly digestible carbohydrates. And so it appears that they inhibit intestinal glucosidases and transporters, meaning that if you feed a carbohydrate along with these polyphenols from fruits and vegetables, you may not absorb as much of the sugars and small starches. Interesting other effect for plant-based foods. And so let's then look at what an anti-inflammatory diet might look like. And I'm going to just run you quickly through what we've talked about before we come to that. There are 3 well-recognized anti-inflammatory diets in humans: Mediterranean diet, DASH diet, and then Dr. Weil's diet. And they're all very similar because they contain a lot of fruits and vegetables, no processed foods, Not very much red meat, a lot of fish, nuts, that kind of thing. So they all kind of look alike. Now let's compare the kind of where we are with most dogs and cats to where we could be with something similar. So this is a super premium kibble. It's not one of the big three. It's a kind of, they would call it a holistic kibble, and it's available all over Europe as well as the US. So it looks like it's pretty high in meat. It's somewhat high in meat. If we're looking for refined starches, there it is, right there, refined starch. So it still has quite a bit of refined starch in there. Are we looking for natural fruit and vegetable sources of those polyphenolics and fiber? Well, here are your fruit and vegetable sources. That's really for fiber. Dried tomato pomace. And again, look at it, it occurs after the flavoring, so flavoring isn't there in high levels. And then there are your carrots, apples, and cranberries, and look where they are. They come after micronutrients. And the problem is you can't make kibble with a lot of fruits and vegetables. It has to be, I believe the level is something like 3 to 4% before it begins messing up the kibble formation. So you just can't do it with kibble. On the other hand, here's a raw diet, and behind the meat, you've got lots of produce. The squash, apples, and carrots are way up there. And then after a fiber source and fish oil, the spinach, broccoli, blueberries, cranberries, we like to see this whole rainbow of colors. And then come the vitamins. So a different, very different percentage of fruits and vegetables. For the vets in the room, I want to just bring up this one other very interesting thought. So let's say that we have a dog with chronic skin inflammation, food allergies, environmental allergies, we don't know. And so what we want to do is put them on a hydrolyzed diet. And these hydrolyzed diets, for everybody else, basically have eaten the proteins down with an enzyme into such small peptides that the immune system doesn't know it anymore. It can't recognize it. And so it reduces any source of allergies if the allergy is to a food component. So one of these basically uses hydrolyzed chicken. It's hydrolyzed chicken liver, so they can get some chicken in there, but the immune system cannot recognize it and can't mount an allergic response to it. You can't use high levels of these peptides because they taste bad, they're bitter. So it's kind of a dance that you do, but something like 80% of dogs that are allergic to chicken can eat this hydrolyzed chicken diet. The problem is that the first ingredient is starch, pure starch. And it made me wonder, here we have a protein that's all broken up, almost to its building blocks, amino acids, and we have a pure starch, which is just almost sugar once it's broken down. Do you remember what the Maillard reaction requires to make Maillard reaction products, or AGEs? Starch, a sugar, and an amino acid. And so I went looking for studies to tell me whether it was a bigger issue with a hydrolyzed diet. And sure enough, this is a study where they looked at infant formula, which was cow whey hydrolysate, and then cow and goat milk, and they looked at CML, which is one AGE, carboxymethyl lysine, so it's just one of many that you can measure. And in this case, the milks had anywhere from 4 to 95 micrograms per gram of CML, but the hydrolysate had over 4 times that, 2 to 4 times that. So that is probably a hydrolyzed diet is probably the last thing you want to treat an inflammatory skin disease, because it's probably very high in AGEs. Just food for thought. So before we just quickly run through what we've talked about and then talk about the anti-inflammatory diet, we do have to talk about controlling energy intake or calorie intake. If you're familiar, 5 minutes? Yep. If you're familiar with the Purina Lifetime Study, amazing study done over the lifetime, 15 years of Labrador Retrievers. Some were fed kind of a lot of calories, a fixed amount per day, and some were fed about 80% of that. And among all of the other things that they found, namely that the ones fed 80% less lived longer, they also observed that T cell, which is an immune cell, T cell function was less impaired when they were eating fewer calories. And so reducing calories does actually reduce inflammation from at least that end of the immune system. So just quickly running through what we've talked about. First, we know that chronic inflammation is present. It's present in dogs, well recognized. Probably in cats, we just don't have as many studies as usual for the poor cats. Do macronutrients contribute to inflammation? Probably in people. Some studies do say that a high glycemic index diet can contribute to inflammation. In dogs and cats, we have sort of some indirect evidence, but we just have to be aware that most of these studies compare a kibble to a kibble. If you look at kibble compared to raw, in fact, there is really good evidence that a raw diet is anti-inflammatory compared to a kibble. Do some individual ingredients have an anti-inflammatory effect? Yes, I showed you that review article. There are plenty of studies if you want to look for proof yourself, and then I showed you a couple other that weren't in that article. Does processing contribute to inflammation? Yep, I showed you there are both controlled studies and case reports in dogs showing that AGEs are contained in high levels in these pathologic tissues. And it's preliminary, to say the least, but I think we have early evidence that probably AGEs do contribute to inflammation in dogs. We know it's true in humans. And then, do we have an anti-inflammatory effect for pets? So going back through those three aspects of nutrition, if there's a macronutrient effect, the kibble probably is not going to cut it because it has to contain highly digestible carbohydrates for formation. If it doesn't contain significant carbohydrates, it's not ever going to be a kibble. So possibly we need to have a low carbohydrate diet. Is it a processing effect? If it is, but due to those AGEs and loss of heat-sensitive antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, then that suggests a minimally processed diet, raw or very lightly cooked. Is it an ingredient effect? Then we need to be including significant amounts of fruits, some vegetables, and kibble cannot contain enough. It can't be turned into kibble if it does. Canned foods, maybe you can include more. Canned foods are a little bit more forgiving, but again, they're heated, so they're going to destroy some of those. So again, we're kind of back to a minimally processed diet as an anti-inflammatory food. So just to kind of clarify, if you think about this on a spectrum, kibble and canned food are right there with what we would call ultra-processed. In humans, this is called ultra-processed. In veterinary nutrition, this is called pet food. Anyway, going on up, these lightly cooked, they probably do undergo some of those changes, but they're certainly not as bad as these. Canned foods are cooked at about 250 for an hour. Extruded foods, it varies, but for about 4 minutes, they go up to 250. And then they, for about 20 minutes, they're up at, it kind of varies, but they're at high temperatures. This, the minimally processed, and especially the raw, is probably where we're going to find anti-inflammatory diets. And one more note, there are no nutritionists in this audience that are going to criticize, but I'm just going to tell you that you're going to get pushback from nutritionists because they'll say, you're not testing one ingredient or one nutrient and controlling for all of these other changes. Well, guess what? Human medicine, human nutrition never did that. It's about a way of eating, a philosophy of eating. And so I think that we need to kind of get over that. We need to test one nutrient or ingredient at a time. We have the information we need. It's a way of eating. And so, to me, an anti-inflammatory diet is likely going to have a low glycemic load. It's likely going to be low in digestible carbohydrates. They may not influence inflammation, but they do participate in the formation of AGEs. There are some pets who cannot eat a diet that's low in carbohydrates because it has to be then high in fat and high in protein. So this does not apply to all pets and maybe not to yours, so you have to be careful about that. We should have fruits and veggies in there in significant amounts. And I know that there are some raw diet makers who believe that dogs, cats, and certainly, but dogs are carnivores and don't need any fruits and vegetables. Fine, if you want your dog to live like a wolf, they do eat some fruits and vegetables, but they also only live to be about 8 years of age. We want something completely different for our dogs. We want them to live to be 15 or 20 or 25. So we do better with fruits and vegetables in the diet. And then we want to make sure that there's minimal processing to get what we need. And the processing to make a safe raw diet, there are ways to do it, as you'll hear a little later. And then there should probably be some fish or fish oil in the diet to supply omega-3 fatty acids. So to me, it needs to be complete and balanced because I'm a nutritionist and that's low-hanging fruit. If you're feeding a diet that's not complete and balanced, I think it's dangerous. You will not see overt signs of a nutrient deficiency. What you will see is when your dog or cat develops some sort of illness later in life, it's going to be a lot worse because now you have metabolic enzyme systems that are in need of micronutrients that you weren't giving them when you were not giving a complete and balanced diet. So it needs to be complete and balanced. It should be probably raw or lightly cooked. It should contain significant fruits and vegetables and fish. That's what it looks like to me, so it's not a kibble. All right, we're going to do questions later, correct? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.